You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome to the TeachThought podcast. Terry, introduce yourself.
My name is Terry Ike. I'm a former classroom teacher and now director at TeachThought, which means I do a lot of different things very badly.
And I'm Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of Professional Development here at TeachThought, and hopefully that means I do a lot of different things really well.
And together we're hosting a podcast, which hopefully makes TeachThought more accessible to you in more places, right, Drew?
Well, hopefully, yeah, but mostly it's just me hosting it because you just add episodes every so often, right?
Well, you know, I've got things to do. Remember, I'm director.
That's true. As always, thanks for tuning into the podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of TeachThought Professional Development, and of course, we always welcome folks to visit or invite folks to visit our website, which is wegrowteachers.com, to find out more about our workshops and services, and of course our summer TeachThought PBL Grow 18 learning event, which by the time this is published, our registrations should be just about wrapping up for regular registration. June 9th is the cutoff for that, and then of course we'll have late registration. So again, you can find all that information at wegrowteachers.com. In today's podcast, I spoke with Zak Stein, who bills himself, at least on his website, as a writer, educator, and futurist. He is deeply involved in work around social justice and education. He's a scholar at the Ronan Institute and serves as co-president and academic director of a think tank called the Center for Integral Wisdom, as well as some other things that you can find information on his website, which is zackstein.org. It was really fascinating and deep conversation as we explored the role of education and how that sort of looks in the modern versus postmodern versus his work, which is metamodern. Talked a lot about social justice, a little bit about IQ, constructivist and progressive education, and paternalism, sort of teacher authority, and what role teachers should play in a meaningful education, and lots of other things surrounding that. So again, really deep and thoughtful conversation that I enjoyed, and I hope you do as well. Without further ado, here is Zak Stein. All right, welcome. I am here today with Zak Stein, who's calling in from Vermont, and I'm going to let him unpack his varied background and the roles and the work that he does, but I'm anticipating a really thoughtful, deep conversation as we get into education and learning and perhaps some developmental psychology. So, Zak, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you. It's always a pleasure to get a chance to speak with an educator and to kind of speak to other educators. So a few words about me. Let's see. I'm what is sometimes referred to as a high-achieving dyslexic. And so I've been in kind of a strange relationship to schools from a very young age.
Right.
So for a long time, I looked at schools a little bit differently because I was in all of the special education programs, first in New Jersey and then in Massachusetts. So, you know, that led to me have a natural curiosity, I think, about the nature of learning, because I was told by my mom, who was a special educator, and then by the great teachers that I had, that I learned differently than other students. And so right away, I was thinking, well, there's not one way to learn.
Right.
And I was noticing there's people who learn different ways and et cetera. And so I went on this kind of very non-traditional learning trajectory. I taught myself music and began to read way outside of classes, even in high school. I ended up going to Hampshire College, which is also a unique undergraduate institution where there's no tests and there's no grades, and you don't get, you get these long written reports. And so I went there because of that.
That's blasphemy.
Yeah, totally. And that's why I went there, because I hate it. And, actually, as a senior in high school, I wrote, or maybe a junior, I wrote a letter and circulated it to the administrators of the high school protesting the SAT. and and specifically the monopoly of the educational testing service, et
I
cetera.
bet that was well received.
By a couple, but not by the key people. Anyway, so I went to Hampshire because of that, because I knew it would be a crazy place, and it was. And then I managed to go from Hampshire to Harvard, which is an interesting move. So I didn't have a GPA leaving undergraduate, and bombed the GRE, and through sheer force of will and kind of getting really close contact with a couple key professors, and of course the writing sample, et cetera. Like I managed to get into the master's program and then the doctoral program at Harvard. And there I continued my habit of reading way outside of classes and ended up writing a dissertation that became a book immediately published through Routledge on social justice and standardized testing. At the same time in graduate school, I was working with Dr. Theo Dawson, who I met at Hampshire, to build a nonprofit that could potentially change the whole standardized testing infrastructure. That's called Lectica. Theo still runs that, and it's going strong. It's great work. So I stepped back from Lectica in order to continue to write and to do freelance scholarship, essentially. And so I've been working with think tanks focused on cultural reform, specifically the Center for Integral Wisdom. And I've got a seat as a scholar at the Ronin Institute, which is a very interesting, again, non-traditional academic institution that's housing a bunch of scholars who, for whatever reason, don't want to be or cannot be in the traditional academy. And so I spend most of my days writing and doing consulting and speaking around issues of education reform. I'm particularly concerned with the kind of current rapid transformations in global culture and identity formation, specifically with regards to the internet and changes in the economy and the biosphere, which are, I think, altering the things we need to consider as educators, and the things we need to consider in the design of schools are very different today and will be even more different, let's say, 10 years from now than they were for the past 30 years. The rate of change itself is accelerating, as it were. And so that's kind of the space where I hang out. My graduate training was in educational neuroscience and cognitive developmental psychology. So I did a lot of research kind of in the field in developmental psychology and some neuroscience. So I've got that background as well. But my passion's kind of basically philosophy, which allows me to kind of be interdisciplinary by nature. And that's why I tend to love talking to educators, because any good educator has to think interdisciplinarily by the demand of the task, basically. So I find educators actually more open to philosophical reflection than specialists in many other fields. So that's why I'm happy to talk to you today, and I think it's going to be a great conversation.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And let's kind of start with maybe a more macro approach. And one of the things that we talk about here, or is sort of our mission statement, or actually a mission question, because we really believe in inquiry, revolves around preparing students for what we call the modern world, which of course is, we have to really think, what does the modern world demand, or what will it? And before we get too deep, I'm wondering if you have any distinction, or where you place yourself on sort of the spectrum between or around postmodernism and what's, I guess, being called metamodernism, and how you see your work and your thinking finding a place in that spectrum.
Right. Yeah. Great question. I would definitely identify as a metamodernist. And so, looking at the evolution of culture, from the ancient cultures into modern culture, and then from modern culture into postmodern culture, which is mostly where we are today. There are some who speculate, and you're aware of their work, that there's a new emergent, which is metamodern. And now this gets weird, because how many other prefixes can we put in front of modern? So I'm not super thrilled about the term, but I think it does signify a break from the the postmodern and the ability to consider the critiques of postmodernism and the complexity that postmodernism adds, and also consider what modernity brought us, the benefits of what the modern revolution brought us. To consider the benefits of both is a novel possibility.
So before you go further, because I want to be sure that listeners, I don't want to assume that they understand what postmodern means, and so how would you operationalize postmodern? And I suppose you're sort of doing the same with metamodern as you're talking about those differences. But is there a clean definition so we can work with that?
Yeah. So it's best, and you almost have to characterize postmodernism by first talking about modernism.
Right.
And so modernism, and there's many different ways to define it, of course, and there's whole books and whole shelves of books written about what modernism is. But I think a useful way to think about it is in terms of the development of perspective taking. And so I use this definition because of my training in developmental psychology. So what modernism did in many ways was find a way to really powerfully organize reality around a single perspective and a single abstract perspective. So one of the characteristics of modernism, which along with the scientific revolution and the revolutions of industrial technologies that led to global capitalism, you had the ability to start to centralize and to record keep and to make things objective and make them make sense in unprecedented ways. And all that sense making was done basically through a single lens. And this is sometimes called the grand narrative, right? Which is to say, there may be other views of what's happening when a colonialist empire goes into Africa and destroys all the small local farms and builds a single large agricultural venture with perfectly geometrically symmetrical rows and where you can actually predict crop yields from thousands of miles away, based on so when they step in and remove the kind of disorganization and organicness of the traditions and replace them with the kind of singular kind of geometrically perfect modern form, they view it from the single perspective. This is the advance, right? What postmodernism comes in and says, well, what about the displaced people, right? They clearly didn't have your modern view. And they had a very different view of what happened to them vis-a-vis the modernist colonial impingement upon their original traditional farming practices, let's say, or educational practices. So what postmodernism does is it says, listen, modernity, there's more than one perspective. There's actually innumerable perspectives on what's going on. Innumerable, literally, like there's so many we can't get a comprehensive catalog of the perspectives. And so whereas modernity had the pathology of the monological single view, postmodernity has the pathology of the aperspectival madness, is Ken Wilber's phrase, right? And this notion is that, well, if there's so many perspectives on what's happening, let's say about a colonialist farming venture, there's so many, which one's the correct one? And the postmodernist says, there isn't one.
Right.
Right. The modernist says it's us. The correct answer is the one that's progress, that the green revolution, so-called, which brings more crops to more people, et cetera. The postmodernist says, well, first of all, check your science, because your yields are actually not higher than the traditional practices by this perspective, right? From another perspective, what you've done is exploitative and unjust and destruction of traditional cultures, et cetera. And so it's a very basic conflict between how do you view the world? Do you view it from a singular perspective, or do you view it from a multiplicity of perspectives? So there has to be something after postmodernism. That's culture evolves, evolution goes places, and evolution often works by taking something singular, breaking it into multiple pieces, and then reintegrating at a higher level to some kind of new organic unity. And this is what a metamodern view attempts to do, or my favorite metamodern view, which is integral theory, or another one like Roy Baskar's critical realism. What they do is they say, okay, we're going to let the perspectives of postmodernism proliferate. There's many, many, many perspectives on that colonial farming venture, right? Each one has a moment of truth, and yet we can organize them. right? And yet we can make judicious decisions about which views are most reasonable and eventually get a kind of catalog of the viability of different views. And so one of the things that characterizes the move beyond postmodernism is a reemergence of hierarchy and evaluative distinction and a reemergence of objectivity, but not the simplistic modern objectivity, an objectivity that has to do with the refraction of different perspectives. And so there's many different kind of currents of metamodernism. I tend to like the ones that are more strongly theoretical, and but there are others that are simply aesthetic, which is to say there's a large artistic movement that is metamodern. And then there are metamodern cultural styles, which are seeing with the kind of new eclecticism of a kind of positive global multiculturalism, which is different from the postmodern view of the always in conflict, always competing for power. Right, there is a view where you could see actually a new synthesis, a global renaissance. That's more the metamodern view. There's got to be a reuniting of the fracturing, and not a going backwards to modernity in a single narrative, but a weaving together of multi-narratives into a single narrative.
So how does that play into or juxtapose with sort of, I know you, like you said, you've done quite a bit of work on social justice, and as you mentioned, the hierarchical structures and the postmodern connection with sort of identity politics and that fracturing, but then bringing that back together. So how does that social justice picture advance from postmodern to metamodern?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very good question. The term social justice is actually a difficult one to use these days for a variety of, the terms become politicized.
Right.
That's some of my response, which is to say, metamodern moves, whether they're political or aesthetic, and the same can be said of integral moves. These are moves that are always seeking to foster synthesis and integration and master multiple perspectives. And so some of what you're seeing from the so-called social justice camp are actually moves that are not that. They are moves to scapegoat and moves to deepen fracture and actually to dismiss the possibility of mutual understanding.
Right.
So the metamodern seeks to understand even the degraded and guilty.
Right.
Why?
Right.
Why are they this way? Not finger wagging and burn them at the stake. So there's something about the move to restorative justice that's metamodern, and too many so-called social justice crusaders, or whatever you want to call it. I think it's a travesty that the term social justice is being dragged through the mud, but that's another story. The point I want to make is that the tactics and ideology of some of the protest cultures are so obviously conflictual and antithetical to mutual understanding that they become unjust themselves. And this is it's a tragic irony. And so that what that means is that the real work for social justice is hindered because now social justice is a bad word, and rightfully so in the mouths of the intellectual dark web when they're castigating some of this behavior that's taking place on campuses. So that makes my conversation as someone who thinks about social justice actually in a very clear way, having worked on Rawls for my dissertation and read deeply with Martha Nussbaum, that there's a way of thinking about social justice that's always reconciliatory and that always is predicated upon deepening mutual understanding between parties, as opposed to deepening misunderstanding and animosity. And
yeah, so you talk about that intellectual dark web, which if folks we're not familiar with that, probably are perhaps more so with the New York Times article and sort of the push by the more mainstream media. So Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro and Weinstein, all of those folks, and as you mentioned, sort of the things going on campus about free speech and that position that unfortunately some are placing themselves in of, well, you're different than me, then because you can't understand me, we can't have, because you're different, you can't understand me, which then for me, in my mind, is a place where now how do we bridge that gap, as you're sort of talking about that? How do I understand who you are and use that as that difference, but then find a place where we can come together? And that's a really difficult piece, I think, going forward as we think about equity and the work that you've done around IQ, and we have Charles Murray and his book that talks about IQ and associations with race, and how reductivist that is, because it's really so much more. And I mean, I'm all over the place with this sort of rant, but
but it makes sense. It makes sense to free associate to the IQ in this one. Because the IQ is actually one of the perfect examples of an instantiation of the modern perspective, right? Because the IQ says the mind is this thing that can be understood in a single number. And the result of that number is a simplistic hierarchy of capacities. Right. And so, there's a deep critique of the IQ, which I run through in my book. And, we can rehearse it here if you want, but I think that the issue has to do with, the reason we're seeing what we're seeing in the public culture has a lot to do with the structure of the educational system and this really messy transition in educational institutions between the modern perspective and the postmodern perspective, and even the emerging metamodern. Because for a long time, and in fact, most of the people who are in power now, which is to say the baby boomers, these people were educated in modern educational institutions with desks and rows. I mean, my mom was slapped on the hand with a ruler by a nun. That may happen in some places now, but you'd be sued if you did that today. Right. So things have changed, and you had many institutions, and the ones that I attended are included, were this strange amalgam of the modern and the postmodern, where there was still this strict authoritarian structure in many cases, and yet intellectually there was a questioning and a critique and a multicultural emphasis. And so some of what we're actually seeing play out in the public culture is the failure of our broader educational institutions to navigate through the modern to postmodern shift, and into the metamodern, which is what I write about in my book that's coming out later this summer, which is what would a metamodern school or an integral school system look like beyond both the modern and the postmodern. And so the trick with postmodern education is that as soon as you go into the aperspectival, where there's not one correct perspective, but every perspective is equally correct, it becomes very hard to teach and actually very hard to learn, because teacherly authority depends upon some type of at least minimal hierarchy of competence and understanding. And that relies on some minimum relationship to a world that's real, that both the student and teacher stand in relationship to. So you take that away, and then all of a sudden you have a crisis of teacherly authority at all levels of schooling. And that's an interesting situation and a very big problem.
That is interesting. And one of the disagreements that I have had with a guy named Gary Houchins, who's been on my podcast before, he's a Western Kentucky University professor. He's really big into school choice and has even gone so far as to say competition, drives excellence, those kinds of things, which I think is not, and looking at your work, I think you would hold that in as a value as well, that education, in the education realm, competition is not going to produce the results that we're after. But his mindset is around giving parents ultimately choice so that they can choose an education for their child, which sounds great. And my question is, how do we make sure that the teaching and learning is of high quality and those choices aren't driven by superficial things like test scores or even IQ scores, or just those simple reductivist things? And how do we keep that quality, that lens of quality teaching and learning as the main driver? And his pushback is that he felt like that's paternalistic. So it's in conflict to what he's pushing as sort of school choice, saying that we shouldn't be, is sort of the what's the term you use, the teacherly authority, or
teacherly authority.
Yeah, which is I'm thinking is synonymous to paternalistic, right? I mean,
it's interesting. So when I write about teacherly authority in my book that's coming out, I use exactly that phrase, paternalistic and paternalism.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, again, an interesting place where the modern and the postmodern come into conflict, and where the metamodern transcends and includes the conflict. So the idea of paternalism and something being paternalistic is pejorative in the mouth of someone who is postmodern.
Right.
They're saying essentially, how dare you put your norms upon me, your rules and regulations. If each perspective is correct, then you can't impose your perspective on another perspective. The modern, and of course, think of Dr. Spock, and of course, many people prescribe parenting techniques, but the modern says, actually, no, there's a kind of a developmental thing going on here, and we need to, in fact, very strictly regulate and kind of lay out a geometrical grid of progression for the child to go through stepwise perfectly. That's the modern view, where at this age you should be this height, and at that age you should be that height. If you're not, something's pathological.
Right.
Don't mind that growth is nonlinear. But so that's a conflict, and what that means is that right now there is a crisis of parental and teacherly authority, to be quite honest, which are very similar. But there are, obviously, we all admire parents and parenting, and there's something about a good parent and the appropriate exercise of paternalistic instincts. That's one of the gifts of nature to the human. And so what I feel is that, yes, paternalistic, then there are bad forms of modern paternalism, which is the classic white man's burden. We have to go to Africa and colonize. It's our Christian duty to civilize the savages. That's a great example of a paternalistic modern attitude. But any parent knows that you can't just lay out all the utensils on the table and let the kid pick, because he can pick the steak knife, right? You want to lay out just the actual options that are safe given the developmental stage and the situation, et cetera. So there are appropriate forms of paternalism and teacherly authority. It's easier to see in a situation like that with concrete operations or sensory motor skills, where you don't want to let the kid totally circumnavigate the room. You're going to put a fence around the fire. Right. Is that paternalistic? No. That's the instinct to foster the life of the child. And so similarly, appropriate teacherly authority is done with the child or learner, let's say more broadly. Inappropriate is done to the child or learner, right? And then sometimes you have to do it in such a way that you are, in a sense, imagining their future agreement with you. So these are three different styles. So the negative paternalism is done to the child, right? This is not, who could care what the child thinks or what the child's goals are? Learn this.
Right.
The next step is, well, listen, kid, if you knew it was good for you, / you'll thank me later, is the healthy paternalism of the child who's not quite cooperative, which is to say that you do a thought experiment. It's not arbitrarily exercised authority. You're taking into account the kid's uniqueness, his future trajectory, all of these things you know about him and the intimate relationship you have with him, and you're saying, listen, I'm going to push you on this. I'm going to push you just a little. The best teacherly authority is when it's a journey together in learning, where you're both sharing the same learning goal, right? There, it's different. The kid says, listen, I want to learn how to read. I know you know how to read.
Right,
teach me to read. Different from saying, listen, we're going to have to sit down and struggle to read. And also different from, read every day, 15 minutes this time, or you're dead. So I just think there are these different forms, and it's too easy to mix all of them together and just dismiss parental and teacherly authority entirely, when in fact that's a very dangerous thing to do. And parents and teachers know that, and no one really does that. There's just this confusion in the postmodern modern conflict, which makes many of the postmodernists overstate their claims, essentially. When what they could do is move to the metamodern and say, listen, there's a moment of truth in the modern need to take the steak night off the table and to measure kids in a basic way to make sure which ones have such unique learning needs to need special attention, like my case with my dyslexia, right? That was a modernity that allowed me to be identified and kind of sorted into a different category.
Right. So is I guess I'm hearing then there's the parallels from modern to postmodern to metamodern that might be with a much more traditional industrial schooling prescriptive model to, or maybe it's not the parallel, but the pushback that sometimes we get when we talk with teachers about teaching and learning from an inquiry perspective, which is a pull dynamic as opposed to the push. So kind of as you said, we have a challenge, a driving question, and a problem from which all our questions should be stemming. And ideally, and this is hard to do, so I use that term ideally with all due, process there, is that what we're trying to do is get the students to voice those content pieces as need to knows in order to answer that challenge and that driving question. So it's not, because what we don't want is if I come in and ask a student what they're doing and then why, we don't want them the answer to be, well, I'm doing this for a grade, or because the teacher told me to, or kind of as you said, I'm going to need this in the future, which is really doesn't resonate with many kids. But what we want them to do is ideally say, well, I'm doing this because we're trying to answer that driving question. We're trying to solve for that problem, that challenge, and in the best of scenarios, those are authentic and meaningful and real, not contrived from content. But again, there's a spectrum there. So one of the pushbacks we get when we work with teachers and schools and folks that I think are much more modern from their perspective is that, well, they can't. I mean, if we start the top of Bloom's taxonomy and ask them to create something without first teaching what they need to know and remember, the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, they can't think about nothing. Well, of course they can't think about nothing. That's not what we're saying. So it's just this reductive approach to that pushback, and as one of the things that you sort of a quote, I think it was an exact quote here from one of your writings, is talking about most open source content platforms, and I think you're also talking about EdTech, but cede all authority to the user, and I'm assuming that's sort of the utensils on the dinner table analogy here,
right,
and talking about the classic mistake of progressive and constructivist pedagogy. So is that what you're talking about there? Is that that there are some constructivists who are basically saying just put all the knives and everything out on the table? Yeah, no, I mean, I've never actually seen someone say that. Again, one of the problems with the public culture is that we build caricatures of one another and straw men, but yes, taken to an extreme, and you see this occasionally, and let's go back to John Dewey, because he had this problem. He was trying to initiate what you're describing, like how do you get the emotional goals of the child aligned with the emotional goals of the teacher, mm-hmm, and the curriculum. And I'll get back to emotion in a second. But yes, the classic mistake of the progressive or constructivist educator is giving too much freedom. And what Dewey said essentially was, that freedom is best, which enables more future freedoms, right? Now, there are some forms of freedom that actually, if you allow for them now, you're actually cutting off the possibility of future freedoms. And so this is, the Dewey School, classically University of Chicago laboratory school. Once Dewey relinquished control, became a place where a child, if he didn't want to learn the alphabet, wouldn't have to learn the alphabet. Or if he didn't want to multiply, he wouldn't have to multiply. Right? And so they were giving the child the choice to do other things. But at the same time, that's a key freedom that is actually made, like you're cutting off the future freedom by not giving them constraint now, right? So you can think of we want to constrain freedom only in the interest of more future freedom. Right.
If you like, this is as abstract as you can get thinking about it, because it's a basic issue again in this dynamic of teacherly authority. How does that work? And when are you rightfully able to tell someone to kind of do something or think some way? And how do you get to participate with someone such that they ask you to correct their thinking? And this is the other thing. We talk a lot about the mindset of the teacher, but there's a mindset of the student, right? There's the learner mindset. And the learner mindset conflicts with the consumer mindset. It's just worth mentioning. The consumer is always right. The customer is always right. Whereas the student actually wants to be proven wrong. The true student goes to the teacher and says, please, correct the way I think. Help me, learn.
Right.
And so there's something about cultivating the virtues of learning and being a student that needs to be discussed as well. And again, some of the cultural things, move against that. So that sense of, you want to promote freedom, but not so much freedom that you inhibit future freedom. And then you want to constrain freedom as little as possible, right? You want to put as few constraints as possible. And those that you do put in place are put in place in the interest of, again, future freedom, future ability to learn. That's the kind of Deweyan way to characterize that. And, he worked very hard to try to get progressive educators to see that. He saw a lot of the free schools and really the interesting anarchists and innovations in education that were going on at the time that he was most active. And they were, again, putting all the knives on the table. And, but this was also a time when children had been in mines and been used as farm laborers and could probably wield a knife pretty well.
Right.
So that's another conversation about, the degrees of freedom change as technologies change and culture change. And so right now the equivalent is more like YouTube in the hands of, like a totally open YouTube in the hands of a child. Is the equivalent of there's knives in there that can hurt themselves and get traumatized just from watching YouTube and randomly navigating through it. And so again, who's responsible for that? Is it the technology companies or the parents? And these are the kinds of things that are emerging now in our cultural milieu. They're going to force us to think hard about, again, teacherly authority, parental authority. What does authority look like? What does a healthy form of hierarchy look like after postmodernity? If we don't answer that, then the educational system is going to be a mess for a long time because there'll be no way to lock in any dynamics of teacherly authority, no way to embrace the role of student, and no way to, with dignity and expertise work as a teacher.
Well, it's that word authority. Even I'm sure you'll get some pushback and probably do get some pushback just in so far as that has some stink to it. People don't like that idea. Certainly not the postmodern, because
but you're right. But here's where the postmodernist always steps on their own foot, because by whose authority do they get to critique me? You see, the postmodernist actually wields a great deal of authority in our society. The postmodernist has a tremendous amount of power in some ways, and with the authority of all the other academics and postmodernists, will condemn people openly. So there's a way in which you can't escape the dynamics of power and authority. What you need to do is learn the unhealthy and the healthy forms of power and authority.
Right, and the idea that hierarchies should and even could go away is just patently absurd. But it kind of, and I don't want to stray too far from education, but that just seems like one of the pitfalls that just continually resurfaces in this postmodern mindset.
It does, and again, to me, it's a simple conceptual confusion in some ways. Again, there are pathological hierarchies, no doubt, from day one in humanity. And in fact, if you look at modernity, you can think of modernity as a way to propagate, rapidly propagate unhealthy hierarchy. Like that's what modernity did in many ways. But there are very healthy forms of hierarchy too, and they're like healthy forms of authority. And so it's about moving past the moment of critique and postmodernism into the moment of re-embrace. And that's, again, I think, an emotional dynamic. And without the right training in educational contexts where there's an emotional openness to learning and an emotional openness to mutual understanding in these things. As you're saying, how do we change the emotional life of the student such that they become equipped to learn in a different way? So I hate to say it again, but I do think some of the pathologies of our public culture are very clear manifestations of this broken kind of slapped together educational system that still can't figure out if it's modern or postmodern or metamodern. And I think we're going to see a situation perhaps with the biosphere and geopolitical conflict such that we're going to be, I think, thrown into a situation of either regressing back to modern practices or moving into a very dynamic, very interesting metamodern form of education. And that's what I'm writing about. And most of these days.
Yeah, the pushback and the chasm that seems to be widening between what, I don't even want to get into liberal and conservative as labels, but they certainly surface, but the left and the right, and the postmodern being certainly more on the left, and then the right being much more modern, and it just this battle, and I hear people who, I think Dave Rubin had Thomas Sowell on his program recently, and he has lots of great ideas, and then it comes to education, and it just seems such a reductionist modern approach that I'm just banging my head thinking, such a smart guy, and it's not him alone, but it's just like you said, so the sort of call for going back to much more traditional, at least the language that I've heard, and I'm certainly not an expert in his work, but like we can't think about going back there, but we also can't live in this postmodern sense. This metamodern seems like a way forward where we are really thinking more deeply about the landscape. And I guess as you've written and talked about the traditional education system and your thoughts of where it should be going and perhaps could be, although as I read it, it seems just so utopian, almost mind-blowingly impossible from where we are right now. So I guess if you would kind of dive into that a little bit, like what explain that difference between where we are right now and where you think we should be in the future.
Yeah, I mean, great. I think the best way to characterize this. So, in my book, I think about metamodern education emerging as a result of the intensity of global dynamics in terms of the economic systems, the biosphere, and identity and culture, which means I'm seeing metamodern education emerge out of the pressure of global crisis. And the crisis is a multifold crisis. And right now we're living with educational systems that are more or less pretending that the multifold crisis of the world system isn't occurring. So now, if you imagine that this crisis is occurring, then actually 10 years from now, it may be hard to run, actually literally like logistically, for a bunch of reasons, hard to run schools the way that they're currently being run. So we're going to be forced to rethink it in a major way, and we're going to have all of this new technology. And so what I'm predicting, in a sense, as a futurist, as an educational futurist, is that we're going to see the emergence of what's more like a network of educational hubs that, so instead of the large single high school, you have a dozen or so small locations which serve as nexus points for teachers, students, and community to come together around intergenerational help and transmission of the youth. So it's essentially a kind of a vision for a redux of Paul Illich, deschooling idea, which is the idea that in many societies there weren't schools, and in fact the kids just picked up all kinds of stuff through their spontaneous interactions with the elders, who would allow them to observe work, participate in work, hold special sessions, etc. You can imagine giving something like an educational credit card, which allows you to redeem for time with an elder some kind of educational interaction. And now fast forward to the internet, And you see that we could set something up like that with a skill and time sharing network that's focused around a single educational hub. And so I talk a lot in my book about that contrast between the kind of large, centralized, modern/postmodern school system, which is straining under resources and all kinds of problems, and this kind of agile, flexible, metamodern educational hub network, which will actually free the youth and the parents. And so again, you're right that it's utopian. And I explicitly say in the book that some of what we need to do now and some of what characterizes the metamodern is concrete utopian theorizing, which is to say realistic alternative futures that are adjacent to this one that would require some miracles, but that are very real given what we have available. This is like the work Buckminster Fuller did when he said, listen, we have everything we need to feed everyone and live happily. We have everything materially that we need. It's a question of politics and the moral will. And I feel the same way about education. We don't need to make education a scarce resource anymore. We don't need to have all of this competition and all of this elite status and all of these accoutrements and problems with the hierarchy of traditional modern education. We can begin to think very differently, but it requires a whole bunch of things changing, not just the schools. And that's why I'm saying you have to see it in the context of this meta crisis. You have to see it in the context of economic systems changing. For example, like technological unemployment and something like a basic income guarantee. I would change the game in education. You'd also have ecological crisis, which can change the game in terms of disrupting supply chains and bus routes and things of that nature. You have the cheapening of educational technologies like computers, which can now be put in every kid's hand in a very realistic way and do stuff unimaginable even 5 years ago. So all of these factors are going to congeal. And I think it's strange actually to think about the educational system 10 years from now and wanting to think of it as like a better version of the one we have. Like we need to think about something totally different emerging.
Yeah, we sometimes joke here, we think about, like, when will we think about the schools of the past the same way that we thought about seatbelts in cars? Like, how could we ever have ridden around in cars without seatbelts? And that's absurd, right? But, when will we get to there, and how do we get to there? Because as many have pointed out, we continually try to refine a system that is doing or has done things that are now obsolete. So we have to redefine how we're doing that, and what are the commodities in education that will be, I guess, non-negotiable for success of individuals in 10, 20, 30, 40 years? It's clearly not content mastery. And we talk about, I just yesterday had a conversation with a school talking about how different it should be. It's not that we should expect people to come out of any course or class or school with content mastery, but to be able to think like a content area expert, if you will. And the difference between being an expert and having expertise, and the ideas, and the even to go so far as is how that looks as a teacher, right? So we're not delivering the content, we are architecting the design of our instruction so that we're creating scenarios in which we can find just that fine razor line as we demonstrate the artistry of teaching, to know when to push, when to come back. Sort of what you were talking about earlier is that's the artistry of teaching. But we also have to be architects of the design so that we can, those situations can arise. And that therein lies the biggest challenge. So is there any difference in your mind in what adults will need in 10, 20, 30, 40 years from sort of the conventional wisdom of what's being pushed?
I mean, if anyone's telling you that they know what the world's going to be like in 20 years from now, raise your eyebrows and be skeptical.
Right.
So that would be my first response. And I think that is, in fact, the novelty of the metamodern position. Like the postmodern kind of denies the historical and denies the unfolding, almost denies reality. So it's very hard to know what they would predict about the future. The modern had this lockstep, progressive definition of linear history, and it was getting better and better and better. You know, the metamodern stands and looks at both, and then looks just at the concrete situation and says, wow, this is a very dynamic moment in a historical unfolding, and we're caught up in certain logics that are like moving like through us into something unknown. And so I think that means we need to teach people how to learn. And this is, again, the classic constructivist idea, is that education should be about how to forever be educating yourself. Right? Learning should be about how to forever be learning. And in contexts that are unpredictable and uncertain, and in contexts where the future really is unknown, that means that we need to prepare people to be ready to learn and to be always curious and observant of their surroundings and all of these other factors, which are very different from a very domesticated, modern, predictable form of education. In fact, being a very good student in some schools today may make you ill-equipped to be in other contexts that are more dynamic. And if you look at the people who are leading the charge in some areas of technological development, real innovators, often they have very unusual educational histories. And in fact, often didn't do traditional modern schooling well at all. So if we could give those types of unique experiences to every kid, instead of getting some of them to be these nicely packaged modern products of education, which no longer fit on the shelf because there aren't even shelves anymore for that product or that kind of product. It's very outmoded, and it's uncomfortable to hold that complexity and dynamism, though. And we need to learn to turn the kind of almost anxiety of the unknowing into curiosity. And so that's, again, the modern and the postmodern step back from that awareness of that the world is to be known, and the world is to be, it's an actual exploration, right? It's not the modern building of progress where we're going to build this perfect thing. It's the society, humans are evolving and continue to explore. So yeah, I would, if I was going to build a curriculum, it would be about specifically teaching adolescents about the learning sciences and about their own brains and about their own bodies and how the body adapts and heals and how the mind learns and evolves, so that you would give them sovereignty over their own future development, both physically and psychologically.
That metacognition that is we rarely have time for in an industrial model, and even in lots of classrooms today, that being okay with uncertainty and not knowing, and the idea that we certainly know lots of things, but there's an infinitely larger amount of things that we don't know. So what questions do we need to ask, right? What are the most beautiful questions that we should be pursuing? Because there's just an unbelievable amount of questions, and we should probably choose wisely.
Yeah, no, that's right. And the dominant question driving education in modern contexts is, how do I find a spot in the social system? E.g., how do I get a job? Mm-hmm. And I don't want to reduce all of it to that, because of course there's always been streams of the humanities and other things, but that's mostly how the modern system was built in terms of human capital theory, where the educational system is actually designed in order to produce workers for the economy, to feed the human capital into the system. And it sounds critical and postmodern, but it's just right there. And from a modern view, it makes a lot of sense. And so that was the dominant question for such a long time. And postmodern kind of said, just make up your own question. And any question is good as any other. I think the metamodern may signal a return to the questions humans have always asked themselves. My favorite one being, what is the human?
Right. What does it mean to be human? Yeah.
What does it mean to be human? And so, even beyond civics and the teaching of nationalism and the nation state, that reflecting on the human condition itself is something that's going to have to be done at scale in something like a metamodern education system. Even if only to deal with all of the crises that are happening. And to find unity, we need a good answer to that question. What is the human? And right now, we're very confused about that question in particular.
Yes, it is a very confusing time, and it coming back to education and the reform or the growth or wherever education needs to go is limited in so many ways. I think by the reality that for so many people still, even though the future seems clearly moving away from that human capital theory, but there is the reality that we do have to eat, and we probably are better served by having a job than not having a job. So, you do have to keep at least one toe, if not, in many cases, a full foot and half your torso in that world, because you still, that's part of the game at this point, even insofar as it's changing piece by piece, and it is, as you noted earlier, a really large ecosystem that, and I'm fond of saying, so we move one piece, then we can move another piece, and of course there's lots of pieces. I'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit more about IQ, especially if you don't mind, as you have worked with Howard Gardner, which every educator, or almost every educator, I'd guess, would be very familiar with Gardner and the multiple intelligences. And so what's your take on that, or maybe just in a very basic question, as you talk about intelligences and talk with educators, where does Howard Gardner's work, where should it find its place in a metamodern landscape?
That's a great question. I mean, the theory of multiple intelligences itself, which is at this point, I don't even know how many decades old. I mean, it has really stood the test of time in many ways, and is an early metamodern, late postmodern view, clearly in terms of problematizing that construct of the single unified intelligence. As I mentioned, that's the kind of pinnacle of the modern way of viewing the mind, isolated to a single number. Howard said, well, actually, the mind evolved over evolutionary time, and there are these different kind of modules that came out of evolution and populated the mind with these different capacities, our intelligences. And there's been various lists where he's added a few. And so, I really appreciate that theory. So that, I think, is important. Now Howard was very careful to say, like, there aren't any measures of the different intelligences,
So you can't reduce those to a standardized test, which is, of course, what
precisely, which everyone, it's like the first question people ask him, especially principals and stuff, well, there are tests for these different, so I think that's important to understand about his work. But I'd rather actually talk about Howard's work more recently, which is his work in ethics and professional ethics. And this, to me, is actually where I see his greatest contribution, if I can say that. I mean,
Sure.
I totally honor Howard so much, and it's a privilege to work with him. And his theory of multiple intelligence was there and has had this impact. I think the work in ethics has been less talked about by educators in some ways. And in fact, what he identified were forms of engagement and excellence in ethics that constitute, quote, good work. And so that one of the answers to that question of what should education be about is, it should be about getting people prepared to do good work. It's not that people laze around if there's a basic income guarantee. Even if there's a basic income guarantee, people are going to want to do good work. What does that look like? And so Howard's answering these deep philosophical questions about education. And it's the return to those types of questions that are going to need to characterize the educational system going forward. Because, even how we get food and how we get a paycheck is going to be very different moving forward. So that means we need to think basically about, well, how even under those conditions can I be a good person? What does that mean? It's just interesting to note that he saw and documented empirically the kind of breakdown of professional ethics in journalism. And this was in the 90s, early 2000s. And we're seeing that play out, of course. And a lot of it had to do with the intergenerational transmission of the ethics themselves, a breakdown between the older journalists and the younger journalists in terms of transmitting those kinds of professional ethics. So it's just, again, something to note. And So yeah, when I think Howard Gardner, I always think those two things, and I always want to talk about the ethics because everyone loves the multiple intelligences, but in fact, I think it's the ethics work where the most radical implications unfold. Because many postmodernists embrace the multiple intelligence theory. It makes modernists uncomfortable. Metamodernists, of course, love it, but the ethics and the idea that there are right and wrong ways to be, and better or worse forms of journalism, and the idea that we should strive towards professional ethics and educate for ethics is hard to say in some contexts.
So is it hard in ways because it's a value laden approach?
Yeah, it's a value laden approach. It's by definition it's going to say, listen, some people are outperforming others in the area of ethical behavior. Again, this gets back to who's allowed to say that. By what authority can you condemn someone? And these are deep pedagogical or issues of education. So that would be my response: is we bring all of Howard's work, forward. But I think the hardest work to be done is not going to be around bringing in the intelligences, but instead bringing in his focus on professional ethics and curriculums that foster deep ethical reflection.
It's a really interesting thought because as you noted, and it's certainly no secret, or well, maybe it is a secret to lots of folks, but as the development of artificial intelligence and machines continue, the world of work will inevitably change, which I think is a reasonable argument for universal basic income, whether you're for it or against it. But it is a reasonable discussion to have, which of course then leads to the incentivization and why would people work if they already get money and all of that. So is there a resource or a book or something that you would recommend? Because I'm not as familiar with Gardner's work around ethics, just like most people apparently.
Yeah, no, the book is just called Good Work. And then there's a few other that follow from that research project. He picked up with some people who'd studied with Larry Kohlberg, who was the great moral psychologists of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Kohlberg laid out a stage model of moral development that went from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric. And that's a very kind of metamodern hierarchical view of psychological development. You could interpret it in a modern way and think of it just as ladder that you climb towards growth to goodness. But in fact, Kohlberg was much more complicated thinker about ethical matters, and he saw the possibility for very abstract and complex forms of evil. So the stage model of Kohlberg also factors in here. And again, resuscitating or bringing life back into these developmental models, I think, is an important part of the future of education. These are some of the ways that you foster growth in people, is by actually showing them a map of their own potentials. So if you read Kohlberg and you read the 6 stages of moral development, when you read that 6th stage, usually there's an aspiration to try to attain it, unless you're so simple you think you're already there, right? But the idea would be, oh yes, this is a better way. This is higher. And the same thing when you see sports, excellence in sports. There's a developmental path that led from learning to just kick a soccer ball to becoming a soccer star to becoming Pele. There's this sequence of developmental path, and you map that path, and any soccer player is going to want to climb that path. And so I think it's been one of the liabilities of the postmodern approach to kind of kick Piaget out and kick the developmental models out when I think they're actually very inspiring. And, so that was a long-winded answer to Howard's book, Good Work, and he worked with people who worked with Kohlberg.
Well, I'm mindful of your time, and perhaps that developmental psychology conversation is for another podcast episode, because I think we could talk for days and days about
That's my sense.
Sense. So his name is Zak Stein, and you have a book certainly that is already available. It's called Social Justice and the Ed Measurement and the History of Testing and Future of Education, or something like that, right? And we'll link to it in the show notes. But so where should people find you? What should they look for? All those good things.
Yeah, so yeah, social justice and educational measurement. Yeah, that's on Amazon. I've got a website, Zack Stein, ZAKSTEIN.org, and my email's on there somewhere. And I welcome emails, of course. And then I've got another book coming out called Education in a Time Between Worlds. And this book will be out late summer, early fall.
Okay, social media and other places?
I'm actually silent on social media.
Well,
So
good
if
for
you'd like,
you.
Yeah, so if you'd like to get in, that's another conversation. But yeah, if you email me, and but yeah, no Facebook, no Twitter, none of that.
Send a carrier pigeon your way.
Yeah, that's right, an actual letter. No bombs.
Yeah, right. Well, Zach, it's been a pleasure. Like I said, hopefully we can reconvene and talk about developmental psychology and perhaps intellectual dark web and ed tech, and there's all kinds of things that we could talk about. So appreciate your time.
Right on, man.
That'll do it for today's podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and if you didn't hate it, please leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening, and share it on social media wherever you feel comfortable. Speaking of social media, you can find us in all the normal places like Facebook, Twitter, Google+, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and please share us on those places as well. And don't forget about TeachThought Professional Development. You can find us there at teachthought.com/PD.